And Brexit has seen a boon for one esteemed Westminster tribe, the political think tankers. Joining me now are two of their number, Tom Kibasi from the Centre-Left Institute for Public Policy Research and Victoria Hewson from the Legatum Institute, a think tank that looks at economic and political freedom. Welcome to both of you. Starting with you, Victoria, do you agree with Ben Wright there that having red lines, so many of them politically, will limit the ambition of the deal that can be secured?
Well, it certainly sets out some parameters. Once the policy was sort of formulated that we would be leaving the customs union and the single market and also leaving the direct jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, then that does guide you in a certain direction of working towards a free trade agreement, albeit a very deep and comprehensive free trade agreement that should realistically be able to go much further than any free trade agreement before, simply because we start from such a position of openness towards each other's markets.
Or, Tom, does it mean that those red lines will turn pink very soon?
Well, I think what we saw in the withdrawal agreement was the government was prepared to compromise on its red lines. So having told the EU they could go whistle about the divorce bill, having resisted the role of the European Court in the protection of citizens' rights, the government basically caved on every single one of its red lines in the withdrawal agreement. So I think there's no reason to think that they wouldn't cave on their red lines in this next phase of the negotiations.
Right, but Victoria, you want full divergence from the EU. You are happy to some extent with what has been set out publicly by Theresa May. What would that look like for our viewers?
So I think full divergence is probably not the right way to describe it. I think having the right to diverge from EU legislation is extremely important. But when we talk about divergence, we don't mean a full sort of reform and repeal of the whole acquis, or even over time reforming or repealing everything. It will be a gradual pathway towards doing things differently and reforming things where the government of the day thinks that a particular reform or change is the best way for the British economy.
And the acquis you're talking about is the body of EU law.
The body of European law and regulation that will be coming into force in the UK. So it will be, it's a pathway of gradually reforming to make the economy more competitive and to improve various things in the context of international trade as well.
And you would like to see something called the shared market. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so it's a fresh proposal for a new model to govern our relationship with the EU, and it'd be based on aligning ourselves in terms of regulation, but allowing for the possibility of divergence over time. I don't think we want to diverge. I think divergence is a very odd position. It's both anti-business and anti-worker at the same time. It's a very strange position to have. So our proposal is to say that we should be aligned because that's in our interest, the interest of businesses and in the interests of workers.
Right. Why do you say it's anti-business and anti-worker?
Well, so it's one of those things that sounds persuasive on the surface, you know, divergence, deregulation. But actually what most businesses will tell you is that what they want is a simpler life. They want fewer regulations, not more regulations. So a proposal for regulatory divergence is, in fact, a proposal to create even more regulation for business. It's a very odd position for the government to take.
Is that how you envisage it?
No, not at all, because most businesses in this country only trade domestically in the UK market, and any business that exports will always meet the regulatory requirements of its export market. And so the opportunities for improving competitiveness in our own economy and also introducing more competition by way of third-party trade deals is where the real gains are to be found.
Well, think of that from the perspective of a business operating in the UK. It's going to have to deal with one set of regulations at home and then yet another set of regulations to trade into the single market. I mean, this just makes no sense at all. It's bizarre.
Right. I mean, bizarre, says Tim, obviously, Tom, I should say, who doesn't agree with your vision. But is it also bizarre in terms of deregulation for workers' rights? Is that the risk there too, to employees who may fear that your vision is actually talking about rowing back on some of the rights that have been gained?
I must say workers' rights and employment legislation isn't on my list of areas where I would like to see divergence occur at all. But ultimately, that will be a question for the government of the day, and any government that does seek to make changes in this respect will be judged at the ballot box.
Right. I mean, Matthew, the thing is, if we can't have as good a deal as some people would see it, probably Tom sees it, that we have now with the EU, and you would also like to replicate that sort of relationship, what's wrong with full divergence? Why not go for a full cutting point with the EU?
Well, I think between what Tom says and what Victoria says, you do see the grounds for possible agreement, and that is, you might call it the divergence of parallels.
Oh no, not another term.
The agreement would be that we stay as we are for the moment, we stay aligned as we are at the moment, but that we reserve the right to diverge if we want to. My guess is that we wouldn't want to. In the end, it wouldn't make sense, 40% of our trade being with the EU. But there you have the sort of fudge that I could see sticking, if I can stick to one metaphor.
Right, but is that the fudge that you see?
So to an extent, that's correct. We would only diverge. Just because you can diverge doesn't mean to say that you have to, and that we would automatically embark on a programme or a bonfire of red tape, which is the hyperbole that often is used in this debate. It will simply be where there is a good reason to change something, the UK government will be able to do so, and it will do that by balancing the downside risks of any frictions that will then result in our trade with the EU versus our trade with the rest of the world versus our domestic market. And there are so many areas that are ripe for reform. The Treasury, for example, produced an 80-page report last year about areas in financial services regulation where they could make improvements and reforms to improve competitiveness, to make it more proportionate and less costly, and also bring it up to date with technological development.
But is that achievable when the EU's negotiator, Michel Barnier, says we will not get a bespoke trade deal which allows us to pick the bits that we would like and discard the rest, particularly around financial services?
So his comments on financial services, as I understood them from the papers this morning, that financial services are never included in any free trade deal, is just not true. Financial services are included in all modern...
But they weren't in Canada, were they?
They were. There's a full chapter on financial services.
Yeah, but they don't...
It gives market access and national treatment. What it doesn't do is give mutual recognition of your home state. So you would still have to apply for a licence, etc. But that's a starting off point with Canada, where we're much further advanced. So there's certainly a lot of scope.
Do you think that's just a starting negotiating position from Michel Barnier, and actually the EU will move too when it comes to securing a trade deal because they need us, as so many politicians claim, as much as we need them, if not more?
Well, so 78% of Europe's capital markets are based in London, so it is really important. The City of London is really important for the whole of the single market. But I think you should look very carefully at what Barnier has said. He hasn't said that there can be no bespoke arrangement. What he said is there can be no cherry picking. And so what that means is that you can't have the benefits without having the obligations. That should be obvious to all of us. So I think actually what they're saying is there's more room for compromise, but the compromise can't be one-sided. It can't be that we want all the benefits and we won't take any of the burdens. I mean, that's have your cake and eat it is not a tenable position for either side.
Which burdens would you be prepared to accept in order to get the sort of full comprehensive deal that you think would be good for Britain?
Well, as an example, if we are going to benefit from the regulatory development of the European Union, then I think we ought to make a contribution towards that. We're going to have to continue some form of financial contribution. That's quite a reasonable position to have. I don't think we can simply say we want all the benefits of all your institutions and frameworks and rules, but we're simply not prepared to pay our fair share.
So you would accept paying into some sort of EU budget beyond the implementation or transition period? I mean, we are going to be paying into to a certain extent, but paying in substantially more in order to have those benefits.
Well, let's see what a fair contribution is. I don't think it's one of those things you can put a particular number on right now, but of course you have to contribute something if you want to benefit from it.
And what about freedom of movement? Because that is one of the other key pillars of the single market.
Yeah, I mean, I find the rhetoric about the indivisibility of the four freedoms to be slightly ridiculous. I mean, it's not the Holy Trinity.
The EU says it is.
Well, and actually they've compromised on freedom of movement in the past. So they've compromised with Liechtenstein in terms of the number of people going into Liechtenstein. They've compromised in Switzerland by saying in certain sectors where there's high unemployment, Swiss job seekers get preferential job applications, and of course the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine opens up access to the single market for Ukraine without requiring freedom of movement. So they're clearly prepared to compromise because they have in the past.
Right. The new sense of optimism that Theresa May says she has, she's aiming high. Do you share it?
No, she's found another cul-de-sac to go up, and so she maintains an impression of movement.
Although she's got agreement on phase one, of course.
Sort of, yes. You know, by saying that we'll stay essentially in the single market and the customs union until we can think of a way of not having a hard border in Northern Ireland. But she's keeping afloat, and in politics, keeping afloat is often the first thing that you have to do.
Right. I mean, in terms of what will fly with those who voted leave, Victoria, do you think there would be an acceptance around continuing to pay into EU budgets if there was a good enough deal at the end of it?
I think that would be fine. I think, as Sam has suggested, if you wish to continue to participate in a particular programme, then it's perfectly reasonable to pay a cost towards that. And there will be several agencies where actually it will be of reciprocal benefit because the UK has contributed, you know, greatly to, for example, financial services regulatory bodies, where it will be very useful for the EU as well to continue having access to our resources.
Well, we've got a few more months to discuss this.